Hey class, welcome to Chapter 3, Section 3. In this video, we're going to be looking at colonial challenges and colonial government, the government structure. But some of the early challenges had to do with treating the Native Americans. How were the colonists going to go about handling them? There'll certainly be a lot of conflict, but two men I want to point out to you are Roger Williams and John Eliot, two men that came wanting to share the gospel with the Indians. And there were a number of different motives for why colonists wanted to come and convert. Many, of course, wanted to see them become more like Jesus Christ, have a relationship with Him. However, some of them wanted to kind of make them more civilized. And by civilized, we mean more European. They didn't care about their souls, but rather wanted to, again, kind of conform them into the European mold. But Roger Williams and John Eliot were different. If you recall, Roger Williams was the founder of Rhode Island, and he spent a lot of time ministering to Indians and concerned about their souls. He was the guy, if you recall too, said that we should give the Indians money for their land or compensation for it or not take it away. John Eliot, another man, he actually going to go on and learn the Algonquin Indian language, and he translated the Bible into their language. Pretty phenomenal. That Indian group, mainly in Massachusetts, where he also created some praying towns. These were towns where converted Indians came to live to learn about the Bible, God's Word, and also about some of European laws and manners and just town life for colonial, for the colonists who had come to America. But there were a lot of struggles between the Indians and the colonists. The primary reason for these conflicts between the native people and the colonists was the Indians feeling as though they were losing their land and losing their power, and they felt that way because they were. The Europeans were coming in and often kind of kicking them off their land and squeezing them from their territory. But I want you to remember guys like Roger Williams and John Eliot who were really concerned about the souls of the Indians. The colonial government is kind of the main part of this section. I want to just recap again those three different types of colonies. We had the royal, proprietary, and the charter. The royal colonies where the king kept control. Proprietary colony, where the king gave control to one or more individuals, and the charter colony, where the king gave regulations to a company or a group. The charter colonies you see here identified: Rhode Island, Connecticut. This is where they would elect their own government and their own legislature, and they actually would have the least interference from Great Britain. The charter was the one to have, again, less interference from Great Britain. The proprietary colonies, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, this is where the governor was appointed by a proprietor or his heirs, and the king would then have to approve them. In the royal colonies, the king would choose the governor. You notice there that the majority of the colonies are royal colonies. But very unusual, the governor was the head of the colony, but he actually often would live in England and send a lieutenant governor or an assistant governor to rule in his place. He wanted the position and the status of being a governor, but they really wanted to live in Great Britain. And most of these men served 5-year terms. And the governor would respond directly back to the king and let him know what was going on. And of course, America tried to really influence these people to help them out. The governor was quite powerful in all the colonies except for the charter colonies. So you see here on this slide the three main groups in a local colonial government. The courthouse represents the judicial branch. The Capitol building represents the legislature and legislative branch, or back then we called it the House of Burgesses. And this picture in the bottom is the governor's palace. These are all pictures, by the way, from Colonial Williamsburg, which we'll be going to on HST, and is also kind of the biggest seat of British influence in the colonies. Again, the governor had a lot of authority. He had the power to veto laws, which means that he could throw out a law he didn't like. He would regulate land grants. He commanded the local army. The local army back then was called a militia. It was made up of townspeople who fought. The legislative branch, the legislature that met up in this Capitol building in the top right, they had a really important power, and that was called the power of the purse, which meant they controlled the money. And they had to finance the laws that the governor passed. So if they didn't like them, they would often withhold the money. They also controlled the governor's salary. So if they didn't care for what the governor was doing, they wouldn't pay the governor. This was an easy way for them to really control the governor, even though the governor, of course, worked for the king, and the legislature, typically, they're voted on by the colonists. So there'd often be some conflict there, but it was a way for them to control them. Every single colony had some form of legislative system, which is so important to who we are as Americans, because we chose representatives. If you recall, that House of Burgesses, which means House of Representatives, began back in Jamestown in 1619 and continued to this day. And like I just mentioned, these folks in the legislature were chosen by the people of the colony. If you owned property, you were allowed to vote. And then again, in the courthouse over here on the left, most colonies had some kind of a court system. They learned that system from England. That was their base of knowledge because they were English citizens. And a governor would appoint a justice of the peace. We think of them as judges. They called them a justice of the peace, and they would try those people accused of crimes and settle disputes. They also had other tasks like collecting taxes, granting licenses, keeping property records, and other public needs. And for the most part, this court system worked very effectively for rendering justice in the colonies. So the three branches: the courthouse, which represents the legislative system, the legislature, they met here in the Capitol building, and the governor, who carried out the laws. Had some authority, of course, and voice in the government, but no place more so than in local towns. This map here on the top left is a map of Massachusetts, and each little box or quadrant you see here is called a township. And the states, the colonies, were broken up into these tiny little towns or counties. And in these local towns, the citizens could vote directly for laws, and they're really free of any kind of English interference. So they really had a great say, a great voice in how they were run. When citizens are able to vote directly for something, we call that a pure democracy. There's different types of democracy, but a pure democracy is where everybody votes for a law, everybody's voice is heard. And at these town meetings, they would come together in their townships, and they'd be settled by a majority vote. A majority is, of course, 1 plus 50%. And every new settler was given citizenship and allowed to own land by vote of his fellow townsmen. So the people in the town would actually vote on whether somebody could move in and own land in their territory. But again, I want to make mention of the township. The basic unit of government in these small communities was called a township. And then also, again, I want to mention pure democracy. It's where everybody had a voice, everybody had a say in how things were run. There are a couple of things that I do want to make mention of in the towns at this point. One is taxes. The colonists were very used to paying taxes. It's how they had money for their government or their militia. It was a normal thing for them. three types of taxes I've mentioned here: the property, the poll, and the gradual. The primary tax was on property, so anybody who owned land had to pay a certain amount of money. We have that today in California as a property tax. Another kind of tax is a poll tax. That's where people would pay before they could vote. It's a way to help raise money for the government. And then many of the states had what we call a gradual tax. We have that in America today. And a gradual tax means the wealthier you are, then the higher percentage of your income and your property that you pay. So a few types of taxes, and the colonists were very used to paying for them. They knew they needed to in order to survive. Then one thing I love about the way these early colonists worked was how they treated the poor people. They had two ideas. One was called putting out, and one was called round the town. I'll tell you, in colonial days, they didn't put up with people being poor. If you were able to work, you absolutely worked. If you were just lazy and poor, they would kick you out of their town or even jail you. But if you were what they would call an honest poor person who was trying to work and just couldn't make ends meet, they had a couple things they did. One was called round the town. And this is where the poor person, would live with several families for a week each. And so the town would take care of them, not the government, but they would stay with one family for a week at a time, and they'd rotate between families until they were able to get back on their feet. And then the second one was called putting out. This is where one family said, hey, we will let them live with us as long as the rest of the town kind of pitches in and gives some money for taking care of them. I think it's really a great system of community coming together to help out those people. And then lastly, I mentioned a second ago this idea of pure democracy. That's where people would vote. People would directly vote for things. Well, in America, we typically have a representative government or a republic. And that's where we choose representatives to vote for us and make decisions on our behalf. The legislative branches that we saw a moment ago, that would be an example of a representative government. So pure democracy is where every person votes for everything, and a representative democracy or republic is where we choose representatives to make decisions on our behalf. So a few topics today. Hopefully you really understand and grasp the importance and the role of those three different branches of the government, and then ways where the citizens really had a voice and a say in how their colony was being run.